Thank you so much for inviting me to deliver this talk. And I would personally like to extend my thanks to Dr. Selvin V, who you know, uh, approached me with a lot of patience. As you had correctly mentioned, I was busy with the end semester madness here in the University of Delhi. So thank you so much once again, SREE Saraswati Tyagaraja College and Dr. Selvinvi for extending this invitation. Now, as the title suggests, I will be covering a generalized ground on the history of women's movement in India. And we all realize that how there have been these differences. Okay. So how there have been these differences amongst women who belong to disparate castes, class, and communities in India. I can hear a noise. All right. So, how do we speak of women's concerns in the wake of these differences, right? So, I would like to begin with the 1970s, which marks the emergence of second wave of feminist movement in India. I hope you're aware of the first wave of feminist movement in India, which emerged in the 19th century in the wake of disparate social reform movements. Um, there's a lot of disturbance in the background. Okay. So the first wave of women's movement in India emerged in the 19th century in the wake of the social reform movements, and we all know how sati was banned in India, and child marriage was legalized. Child marriage was also banned. Widows' remarriage was also legalized at this point in time because of the efforts of Raja Ram Mohan Roy and Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar, who collaborated with the British regime in initiating these legislations in favor of women's status in India. However, I would not like to talk about the first wave of women's movement in India. I would like to start from the second wave of women's movement in India, which happens with the uh, publication of this report towards equality. This was a report prepared by the Committee on the Status of Women in India, 1974. Now, as you can see on your screens, United Nations designated the 1975 to 85 as the UN decade for women, and it asked the member nation states to map women's access to employment, education, politics, legal rights, and so on and so forth. Uh, as a response, this committee was instituted in 1974, and this has been actually called as the founding text by Veena Mazumdar, as it facilitated a dialectical engagement between the Indian state and its women citizens. So, for the first time, women's access to the disparate spheres of the state, ranging from legal access, economic access, employment opportunities, their status within the legal mechanisms. These were mapped as a response to this call by the United Nations. Another important thing that we need to remember here is that by 1960s and 70s, the ideal of an egalitarian, just and fair nation had started to erode in India. As we all know, by 67, India was pushed into a series of social movements, starting from the Naxalite movement, which happened in uh, Bengal, and it was followed by the Navnirman movement, which happened in Gujarat, JP movement, which happened in Bihar, and finally the national emergency was imposed in 1975. So therefore it becomes all the more important to see how women contributed, at this point in time to these disparate social movements, and how the women's movement emerges out of these. Um, these are a few findings of the report, as you can see. Um, it mentioned, based on statistical data, that the status of majority of women in India had been deteriorating, with the exception of upper middle class women's entry into the academic and service sector. And only 6% of the total women population in India had access to the organized sector of employment at this point in time, which entailed that the rest of the 84% women were still a part of the unorganized sector of economy, which created hurdles and obstacles in terms of policy making for these women to ensure legal justice, to ensure employment safety measures for them, and employment security for these women. Also, as we can see, why women's entry was facilitated into the academic and service sector, because they were considered uh, relatively safe sectors for women. Women could, and these were the reasons, and which were given by people who were surveyed by the committee, that so for instance, the profession of teaching made women easily balance between the private and the public. They could look after their homes as well. They could go back to their workplaces and teach, and come back to looking after their homes, right? So similarly, the profession of doctor, nursing, they were also equally appreciated on account of the services women could render. Now, next was, you can see here that there were these disparity in population. So while in 1901, the report found that there were 972 females for every 1,000 males, the ratio declined to 930 females per 1,000 males in 1971. Also, women's literacy rates were declined. They were 18.7% in comparison to 39.5% for males in 1971. Now we can see how, even as this report is termed as one of the founding texts, there were certain limitations of the report. To begin with, it did not question the making and of the constitution as such. That the constitution was given to reviewing the policy measures which were in place, the legal measures which were in place. So they took it for granted, and they simply mapped the status of women vis-a-vis what was there in the constitution. Constitution is not a given document. There are provisions whereby it can be revised, it can be improvised, and more pro women and pro poor measures could be incorporated in it. So they could not think of this possibility at this point in time. Another limitation of this report was how did not consider the context of health and health services for women at this point in time. And and this is one of the greatest limitations which I find in the report, because they did not consider women out of the ambit of reproductive health. Women's health was important in so long they were able to give birth to healthy babies. Apart from that, their health measures, the other problems that they would experience, they were not taken into account, and they did not get any space in the report also. Can I request the admin to mute the screen and people who are creating a noise here? I'm so sorry, it tends to distract me.
Sorry, ma'am, this will not happen again. Sorry about it.
Right. So now we move on to the next slide, and which deals with violence against women, rape, and dowry. Now, the issue of violence against women comes in the midst of the questions of legislation, and how far laws led to the empowerment of women at this point in time. Now, my submission here is that even as laws were made against rape and dowry, for instance, they were still dominated by a certain kind of patriarchal bias. So the women's movement played an instrumental role in highlighting the patriarchal biases which were there in the legal mechanisms of the state. Now, I hope all of us know about the Mathura rape case, which took place in 1972. Mathura was an Adivasi woman in Chandrapur in Maharashtra. Her family accused her of eloping with her lover, and she was finally brought to the police station where she was raped in custody. Now, this incident stimulated an analysis of patriarchy as a structural violence. In fact, the women's movement was jolted out of its complacence, because it was still in the beginning of, they were at a very initial stage. The movement had not took up as such. Most of these women activists belonged to the left party, affiliated women's organizations, which were primarily working in the trade unions at that point in time, and they were mostly concerned with legal parity. They were mostly concerned with pay parity within the industrial sector for women. So this incident jolts these women activists out of stupor. They realize that something like this can also happen, within custody. So this is a structural violence which happens, and it jolts the women's movement out of their stupor. Now, the women's groups all over the country got together as a result of this case. And what is so interesting here is that it also led to the questions of representation. So, were the upper caste middle class women's activists were able to represent women? So this was a bigger question that the movement was dealing at this point in time, because most of these activists belong to the upper caste middle class section. So how could they seek to represent lower class women? How could they seek to represent lower caste women or women who belong to other religions? There was these epistemological questions which they were dealing with at this point in time. There were these questions of representation. In fact, Radha Kumar, in her book The History of Doing, goes on to suggest that there were these differences pertaining to the theory makers and the slogan makers. So these upper caste middle class women would make theories pertaining to the women's movement. They would chalk out plans so as to how the movement has to be progressed. And there were these slogan makers who primarily belonged to the lower class context, who would simply get together and follow the instructions of these upper caste middle class. Mathura was examined by the doctor on March 27th. She had no injury. Her hymen revealed old ruptures. Other aspects of physical examination revealed she had had intercourses in the past. Presence of semen was detected on her clothes and the pajama of Ganpat, so who was the constable who had raped her. Now, there were these two questions that emerge out of this letter. The first is, and this is what the women's movement then proposed to the Chief Justice of India at this point in time, and it and in order to reform the laws pertaining to rape in India. So to begin with, first was that the history of sexual history of women should not be taken into consideration while preparing evidence. Also, the two-finger rule had to be abandoned. Okay, so we can see how there were these were the patriarchal biases which were embedded in the legal measures which were already in place, and they were apparently there to help women. So if later the letter goes on to state here the problems with the judgment. So it says there is not a single word condemning the very act of calling Mathura and detaining her at the police station in gross violation of the law of the land made by Parliament and so recently reiterated by the Supreme Court, nor is there a single word in the judgment condemning the use of the police station as a theatre of rape or submission to sexual intercourse. There is no direction to the administration to follow the law. There are no strictures of any kind. The court gives no consideration to the social economic status, lack of knowledge of legal rights, age of victim, lack of access to legal services, and the fear complex that haunts the poor and the exploited in Indian police stations. May we respectfully suggest that yourself and your distinguished colleagues visit incognito wearing the visage of poverty some police stations. So this is where they go on to highlight the structural violences which are embedded in the legal procedures for women, right? Also, the women's group at this point in time tries approaching Mathura in order to ask her if she was all right, and if she found this okay, if they could represent her. So I told you before that there were these questions of representation which also arose, and Mathura was in her village, and even as she had no problems with women taking up her case vis-a-vis the institutional structures, but she had no hope, that it could bring in any changes in her plight. So the next case was dowry. Now, from here onwards, we realize that the cracks have become more pronounced. In fact, the women's movement was divided into, if you see this, there were these cracks in the movement, and the movement was divided into two groups. The first was the autonomous women's movement, and the next was the left party affiliated women's movement. Now, autonomous women's movement in the late 70s and 80s focused on women's sexuality, particularly within the rubric of marital and custodial violence, and therefore they also looked at dowry in the context of violence against women, patriarchal violence against women. On the other hand, left party based women's movement interpreted dowry violence as a trait of entrepreneur families who sought skilled women so that they could remarry, gather more wealth, and negotiate the contemporary demands of the new capitalist and liberal economy. On the other hand, what was missing in this analysis of dowry, which was done by both the autonomous women's movement and the left party based women's movement, was the fact that they did not question how dowry is a ritual which is deeply embedded in the Brahma form of marriage. So, in fact, Sharmila Rege, in her article, The Dalit Feminist Standpoint, takes up this issue, and she says that one needs to understand that how this is a ritual which has been codified within the the Brahma form of marriage, and it becomes even more pronounced when the colonial law goes on to ratify the Brahma form of marriage is the only form of marriage that could take place. Now, what we understand by the Brahma form of marriage is the marriage which happens as per the Shaptapadi, taking 7 circles round the fire. And this is what makes a marriage legitimized. Any other, and specifically in the Hindu context, as per the Hindu code bill, any other marriage which does not follow Shaptapati was not to be recognized as legitimate marriage. Now, in Veena Talwar Olden argues in her book Dowry Murder, Imperial Origins of the Cultural Crime, that in the late 19th and early 20th century, dowry was the only independent material source over which women had partial, if not total, control. So we must have heard of terms like Sri Dhan, that women had access to Sri Dhan, and this is what they can utilize in times of need. Right? This was perceived as a means of providing recourse to any emergency. Okay, they in fact, Sri Dhan was a part of movable property, so they did not have the right to immovable property as such. Now the problem begins to happen when the colonial policy tends to privatize land ownership exclusively in male hands, and thereby exerts intense pressure on the indigenous elite that the land cannot be alienated, land has to be kept within the family, and therefore women had no ownership over land as part of property inheritance. And in fact, this is precisely how the Hindu Code Bill also goes on to define property inheritance rights for women, even as the wife has the right to property. As the widow has a right to property, the daughter of the family did not have the right to property under the Hindu Code Bill, precisely because it would have led to alienation of land. However, things have now changed, and after these recent legislations, which happened in 2005, the daughters now have the right to inherit property. Um, Another limitation of the women's movement at this point in time was that they were concerned with sexuality only within the rubric of violence. They did not recognize sexuality in terms of pleasure. They denied all possibilities where women could indulge in sexuality for pleasure's sake. So they were primarily interested with sexuality in the rubric of violence, where the women were victims of domestic violence, where women were victims of rape, and even as they would talk about rape, so this is what Ratna Kapoor has to say, that although the feminist campaigns made inroad in revealing the violence experienced by women, they did not alter the discourse within which this violence was condemned. The shame, dishonor, the notion of women as victim continued to inform the popular and legal discourse, that if a woman is raped, this is where she's condemned to oblivion, she's dishonored, the family name is dishonored. So uh, these were the problematic nodes which the women's movement was not able to deal with. The very fact, in fact, um, Nivedita Menon goes on to question, the universality of women's experience of sexual violence, and she suggests that, that in different cultural context codes that enable the recognition of sexuality and sexual violence, they may not be the same, and the movement failed to recognize this, and putting together women's experience of sexuality in terms of violence. Also, they, when they specifically in the context of rape, this becomes a problem here, because the rhetoric primarily surrounded on the idea of shame, dishonor. Okay, and what is the problem here? What happens when rape is only understood within the notion of shame and dishonor? No, it disables a woman to get back to the public life, to lead a normal public life. Also, it discounts the category of marital rape, what women perhaps go through every day in their marital lives, that does not get any space in this discussion. So these were the limitations in this kind of discourse. So I have mentioned this already. Now, another important aspect that we need to discuss here is the alienating women of minority communities. The committee which was formed to look into the status of women in India, so this 1974 report towards equality, it betrayed its upper caste Hindu outlook by not acknowledging Muslim women as equal partners and stakeholders in reimagining the gendered contexts of the nation in 1970s. They relegated the concerns of Muslim women to the appendix section of the Towards Equality report, and these are, very problematic details which we need to take stock of. Their survey clearly betrayed a sense of superiority that these upper caste middle class women felt over their oppressed Muslim sisters, and some of their findings were that. That no majority of these Muslim women would rely on their families putting pressure on husband and his family for her rights, and this can at best be a negative solution to the problem. They also mentioned that once the Muslim woman becomes educated or starts working, she obviously leaves parda. See, these are the majoritarian biases which the report brings with itself. Assuming that if a woman is educated, only then she's able to leave parda, and so this is where it ended up making such controversial remarks. Also, it mentioned that the awareness of the comparative usefulness of Urdu and Arabic education and government school education that would bring their children into line with other children is on high side and is a hopeful sign for future generations. So we need to also understand here that rather than relegating their concerns to the appendix section, if they would have taken into consideration the structural inequities which women face on an everyday basis across religions, that would have been a far productive exercise at this point in time. Then we move on to the next case, which was the Shah Bano case of 1980s. And as a result of the Shah Bano case, the Muslim Women's Bill was passed in 1986. Now, what is interesting here is that it is assumed that, and see, this is where we counter the finding of the report when it says that majority of women rely on families putting pressure on husband and family for her rights. And that was not at all the case. If you see Shah Bano, when her husband decided to separate from his wife, uh, you know, uh, she filed a case in the court under section 125 of the Criminal Procedure Code. right? So it's women had access to the empowering provisions of law. They, even as they were not a part of the Hindu Code Bill, so to say, which which legislated in favor of Hindu women at this point in time. And of course, the controversies have been raging pertaining to the Uniform Civil Code after this point in time. What we need to understand here is that we need to remove the blinkered perspective via which we have been perceiving women belonging to different communities in India. So, if you see what does Section 125 of the Criminal Procedure Code entail, that it is primarily to do with curbing vagrancy. So anyone who feels that in the event of lack of financial security, one can turn a vagrant, they could lodge this case. So children perhaps can lodge this case against their elders, old parents can perhaps lodge this case against their children, okay, at this point in time. So this was an enabling provision, and she also lodges a case against Section 125 of the, and this is not civil procedure code, this is criminal procedure code. So women across religions had access to empowering provisions within law, and they were not necessarily dependent on their communities to talk of their empowerment, so to say. Now, however, what happens and how things go out of control here is that her husband, Ahmad Khan, asserts that how he was under no religious obligation to support Shah Bano beyond the period of Iddat. Now, Iddat is the 3-month period, the 3 continuous cycles of menstruation after the separation with husband. Now, this further revealed the fault lines between the personal laws and civil code. The government decided to initiate proceedings to launch the Muslim Women's Bill in 86, excluding Muslim women from the purview of Section 125. The bill further seeks to limit the maintenance to the period of iddat, suggesting that in absence of husband offering maintenance, Waqf board should be solely responsible for ensuring that women get access to fair and hassle-free provisions. However, there was no surety that the Waqf board would be doing that. So, now this opens us towards a very complicated issue here, So how does one talk of enabling legal provisions, So is Uniform Civil Code the only way forward? Now, we, as per Kumkum Shangari, Indra Jaising, Flavia Agnes, even, Rajeshwari Sundararajan. So these feminist scholars have deliberated on this question, and they mention that how women should and the rights which they should have access to, they should be made outside the purview of religion, right? So no religion, specifically institutionalized religion, and have the authority to institute laws pertaining to women. So if you see this, so she mentions here, Indra Jaising mentions here that there is a need to institutionalize legal plurality whereby the diverse personal laws are aligned with civil laws ensuring equal rights for women. Now, in reality, whether we want it or not, there is a common civil code that operates for all women, all family codes, all patriarchal codes, be they Hindu, Muslim, Christian, Parsi, discriminate against women. Women have no rights under family laws. This is a common code of discrimination and inheritance. The pluralistic legal systems must be based on the idea of non-negotiability of equal rights for women, right? So now these are very, very important questions. What do we understand by legal plurality? That, there are certain empowering provisions which are a part of these personal laws. So these empowering provisions should be brought together along with the civil code, right? And this is how, one can move out of this conundrum, that because as I have mentioned, the feminist scholars have deliberated on this in detail, and they have arrived at this conclusion that that the communities as such, the institutionalized religion as such, patriarchal structures as such, they are not pro women, right? And this happens across religions. So women's identity should be first legislated in terms of their citizenship rather than their membership in their respective communities, right? So then we move on to the next slide. Lessons for the feminist movement. Now, what were the lessons for the feminist movement? So the Shahabano incident comes as a severe jolt for the mainstream upper caste middle class movement. um, they realize that how difficult it is for women activists to bridge these differences on the basis of caste, class, and religion. Um, so, Radha Kapoor goes on to assert that the women were differentiated by caste, class, and community, and therefore any definition of rights has to be based on these differentiations. As different groups of women have different interests, there is no real basis on which they could work together. Now, the problem with this kind of an assertion is that it also tends to create these differences amongst women, that women cannot speak for each other. So if a Hindu woman cannot speak for a Muslim woman cannot speak for a Hindu woman. So now, there are these differences. A Dalit woman cannot speak for an upper caste woman. An upper caste woman cannot seek to speak for Dalit women. Now, if we go on to instill these differentiations, we go on to atomize identity politics, then the entire logic of the feminist movement fails. And this is precisely why there has been a huge gap now, because the movement failed to engage with these differences. And now we do not have a women's movement in place, right? And the space is empty. It has been taken control of by the National Commission for Women and the various government organizations that claim to speak for women, and women's activism on the ground has been lost. So, what is important here is for us to understand is that that women are implicated within their respective caste and communities. So they also tend to make compromises with the patriarchal structures. And this is what entrenches them further within their communities. And this happens across the religion, across the caste communities. So the moment we claim that women cannot speak for each other, we further entrench women into their caste and communities, so much so that we start assuming that women are not citizens, but they are Hindu women, they are Muslim women, they are Christian women, they are Parsi women, and so on and so forth. So we take away their definition, their conceptualization from citizenship, we place them back into their communities, which is not an enabling gesture at all. Now, another important landmark in the history of women's movement was the rise of the Dalit women's movement. Um, So the feminist visions of the autonomous and the left-oriented women's movement led to the crystallization of the Dalit and minority feminist voices, while the autonomous women's movement does not recognize religion and caste as factors leading to conflicts among women. Women's organizations affiliated to the left parties subsume caste and religious differences in the name of class. So these were the blind spot, and this is what leads to the rise of the Dalit women's movement. So in fact, a prominent Dalit Bahujan scholar Lata Pratibha Madhukar, she asserts that Dalit Bahujan women like us who were involved with protests do not find any mention in the official histories of the women's movement. So if you remember, I have already spoken about these two distinctions, women as theory makers and women as slogan makers, and therefore the Dalit Bahujan women tend to have no space within these official histories of the women's movement. Now, this makes us arrive at the Dalit feminist standpoint. Now, what is Dalit feminist standpoint? So, or what is standpoint theory, so to say? Now, Judith Grant mentions in Fundamental Feminisms that knowledge from a standpoint involves an analysis and a realization of the dispersal of power and its differentials operating among different individuals, enabling the marginalized sections of society to redefine their place, position within the structures of the nation. This is a standpoint which is located at the bottom, so which enables us to do an analysis of the power structure. So it enables us to read up the power structure. Okay, it makes us alert towards the lives of the marginalized communities, and encourages us to shed our privileges. Now, it does not entail that upper caste, middle caste women have to live in this guilt, that how they can never seek to represent Dalit women, and therefore now there is no way forward. In fact, Sharmila Rege, in her article, titled "Dalit Feminist Standpoint," provides a way forward, and she goes on to say that there are that if one assumes that personalized experience or experiential politics is the only way forward, then one is mistaken. Because if one believes that women cannot represent each other because they are located in disparate castes and communities, then it will lead to atomization of identity politics, right? Yes, women are heterogeneous. It's not women is a woman. There is no woman with a capital W. It is not a homogeneous category, of course. So um, what is the way forward then? We do not want to lapse into the furthering of the narrow identity politics. Okay, so this is not going to be empowering for women across communities and castes in India. Right. Also, on the other hand, one cannot simply add women's concerns. Okay. Which again, as Sandra Harding puts it, this would entail add women and stir approach. Okay. So, I hope, I'm able to convey my argument here that one cannot lapse into narrow identity politics. One cannot lapse into atomized identity politics, because if we believe that women are a heterogeneous category and therefore they cannot seek to represent each other, so within the community as well, Dalit women are not homogeneous, Muslim women are not homogeneous, Christian women are not homogeneous, Hindu women are not homogeneous. So we cannot go on doing this atomization of identity politics here. It might limit the emancipatory potential of these disparate women's organizations. Uh, So the concerns of women's movement have largely remained within the purview of what Reggae terms as experience and personal politics, and this is precisely, why the women's movement has failed. Um, Now, the next uh, important question that we move on to is the question of solidarity. Um, so we have already, you know, concluded here that what is the way forward. You know, so there are these three scholars who I would like to mention here. First is Sharmila Rege, who gives us the Dalit feminist standpoint. Now, she mentions here that the Dalit feminist standpoint is viewed emancipatory since the subject of its knowledge is embodied and visible. This position claims a higher emancipatory status, which means that the subject or the agent of Dalit women's standpoint is multiple, heterogeneous, even contradictory. And they bring with themselves liberatory knowledge mechanisms which can contribute to every other liberatory project. And this requires a sharp focus on the process by which gender, race, class, caste, sexuality all determine each other. So we move towards the politics of intersectionality as such, right, which is alert to our position. As intertwined with the disparate class caste community politics, right? Another important way in which we can explore the question of solidarity is by referring to Chaya Dattar. Now, Chaya Dattar responds to Sharmila Rege's article, The Dalit Feminist Standpoint, and she mentions here that there are problems with this standpoint as well, because we need to expand the question of women's movement today. We simply should not be concerned with the caste class communal politics. In fact, bring together a viable women's politics is by and analyzing the structures of power, by analyzing these institutional structures like capitalism, like the transnational economic institutions which play an instrumental role in keeping women poor, right? So we are moving beyond the caste, class, race politics here. We want to engage with structural violences. We want to engage with ways in which the transnational politics, the global north politics, capitalism, they ensure that development happens only on the basis of feminization of labor. So how women, after liberalization and globalization, they have been pushed into the even more into the unorganized sector of economy. It has led to feminization of labor. It has led to the discounting of their labor, and the kind of development that the global north is witnessing, it is deeply contingent on the labor of the poor, the marginalized, who are in the global south, right? And therefore Chaya Dattar talks about the ecofeminist stance, and why ecofeminist stance becomes important, and why do we have to again take into consideration the ecofeminist standpoint, because this standpoint deals with the kind of access and lack of access that women have to the natural and economic resources. So she says that those who regenerate both natural and societal resources can claim a standpoint, and their knowledge becomes liberatory and forms a vantage point for this alternative standpoint. So these are very important questions, so to say, that how today what we are witnessing is, lack of access to natural resources, how, in the name of development and technology and progress and scientific empiricism, one is epistemologically wiping off the indigenous knowledge systems, the creativity which is embedded in these communities, and specifically, which is nurtured by women. And this is how their standpoints are getting affected. Now, another important reading that I would recommend here is, Chandra Talpade Mohanty's Under Western Eyes Revisited Feminist Solidarity Through Anti-Capitalist Struggles, that insists on building a non-colonizing feminist solidarity across borders. Now, and why does she say that? And she mentions here that economically and politically, the declining power of self-governance among certain poorer nations is matched by the rising significance of transnational institutions. And what is interesting for us to notice here is that um, instead of these powerful nation states, we have these powerful and economically superior transnational capitalist organizations like the World Trade Organization, like the IMF. So 51% of the resources, 51% of all the resources are controlled by these corporations like IMF, like the World Trade Organization, and not countries. Also, women in, what is the place of women, therefore, and she goes on to tell us that how women and girls, they are still 70% of the world's poor and majority of the world's refugees. Women comprise 80% of displaced persons of global south. They are the hardest hit by the degradation of environmental conditions, wars, famines, privatization of services, deregulation of government, dismantling of welfare state, and so on and so forth. Thus, feminism without and beyond borders is necessary to address the injustices of global capitalism. So, we need to move out of this analysis which is deeply implicated within an analysis of caste, class, and communal differences, right? Because there are these greater demons that we have to encounter, and this can only happen if we engage in the analysis of power structure from below. So what does it entail? So what kind of standpoints we entail, therefore? The standpoint of the lowest and of the low. So we need to strain harder to listen to the standpoints of the poor, of the Adivasi women, whose indigenous knowledge traditions are getting wiped out, and they are the ones who are putting in their labor so that these urban centers of development could stand on their feet. And this is precisely why the question of solidarity becomes deeply important. So rather than atomizing the identity politics, we move towards the question of solidarity, right? So it doesn't mean um, uh, you know, engaging in this guilt that one belongs to so and so caste. It what does it entail? It entails deploying the standpoint where one recognizes that now the leadership will have to be in the hands of the unprivileged, those who have not been privileged for such a long time. The leadership has to go in their hands. No one needs to no the scales now have to be reversed. The what we have understood as the distinction between theory makers and slogan makers has to be absolutely dismantled now, and we have to move towards seeing how the disenfranchised communities, they envision a just and democratic society which is capable of treating all citizens fairly. Thank you so much.